we're going to talk about authority. Now, one way that I think we could talk about authority, explain it, is control. Because in so many ways, authority practiced is how much can you control. An interesting thing about control is maybe more than anything else in our lives, it's really, really easy to deceive ourselves into thinking we have more of it than we really have. Any one of you who are parents, I'm sure, have experienced the thought that you had control over your child and what you told them to do, only to later discover that you didn't have control over that whatsoever. I think of a story a friend told me that when he was a kid, his mom told him he could only have one bite of cookie. And he said, "Just one bite?" She said, "Yes, only one bite." So he proceeded to take one bite out of every single cookie in the cookie jar. You think you have control, but there's only really so much in our lives that we can control. And when we deal with God, you could take that illustration of the cookie jar and writ it large. That we could think that we have all the things put in place a certain way, but God sees far beyond, far bigger, and has far much more control than we could ever have. There's a reason that the serenity prayer is so popular. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Because so much of our lives is kind of wrapped into that tension and that balance. How much can I control and how much is outside of my control? It's an ongoing tension. And so today, the passage that I'm going to talk about is going to talk to us about control, about authority, and I think it's going to be helpful because we all deal with this. Jesus kind of walks through 4 stages with the Pharisees on their understanding of authority. And although a lot of times we like to read scripture, maybe think we can remove ourselves from the Pharisees, what Jesus has to say to the Pharisees applies to all of us today. In how we deal with authority, how God deals with authority in our lives, and then ultimately, what is Jesus asking of us? What is Jesus maybe taking from us when we talk about authority with God? In this passage, there's a series of passages in Matthew 21 I'm going to talk about today. It goes in 4 stages. Jesus does 4 different things with the Pharisees' understanding of authority. He confronts it, he reveals their misunderstanding of it, he defines their misunderstanding of it, and then he refutes it. He confronts it, he reveals it, he defines it, he refutes it. So we're going to walk through that now. Starting the first passage, the first encounter with authority in Matthew 21. It's a pretty popular passage, I'd say. And it's when Jesus overturns the tables in the temple. In Matthew 21, verse 12, it says, "And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, 'It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers.' And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did," I think they'd be happy, "and the children crying out in the temple, 'Hosanna to the Son of David,' they were indignant. And they said to him, 'Do you hear what these are saying?' And Jesus said to them, 'Yes, have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise.' And leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany and lodged there. And when Jesus comes back, it says, and when he entered the temple, he goes out to Bethany, and then he comes back, and there's a story about him making a fig tree not bear any fruit. But he comes back into the temple, and as soon as he walks in, the chief priests and the elders of the people came up to him as he was teaching and said, 'By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?'" What authority are you doing these things, but who gave you this authority? It's maybe a more proper way of saying, what gives you the right to bust up in our territory and flip over our tables and trample over everything that we believe we rightfully have control over? As so many encounters with authority go, and encounters between us and God and authority go, Sometimes it takes God ripping out of our hands what we think we have control over, what we think we have authority over, to realize that God is ultimately the one in control, and God is ultimately the one who has authority. For the Pharisees, Jesus could not have picked a more contentious place to display his authority than going into the temple. Because the temple, as the experts in the law, as the Pharisees were the experts in the law, that was their place of expertise. That was their place of dominion. We're the people who says what goes on here. We're the people who write the rules. We're the people who tell you what to do. Jesus goes into that place and flips over their tables and says, you're doing this all wrong. You make this place a den of robbers. You are absolutely in the wrong. Can you imagine what it would be like for God to confront your sense of control and authority in that dramatic of a fashion? That would be like God walking up into your business, say you own a business, and he starts flipping over your accounting tables and saying, this whole thing is corrupt. Everything about your business strategy is wrong. Everything about how you're making money is wrong. Or what if Jesus walked into your home, the way you raise your children, and he said, this discipline is completely wrong. The way you're going about this is absolutely backwards. Or it's the other way around. He comes up to your child and says, the way you're treating your parent is completely wrong. I know that's the one you guys want to hear. You completely got this whole thing backwards. But in any area of your life, something you're good at, something that you really believe you have a lot of say and control over, your financial management skills, your music skills, whatever your gift is, and Jesus in some way shows up in your life and says, you are doing this completely wrong. Sometimes, for us to really submit to God's authority, that's what it takes. Sometimes he has to flip over some tables in our lives to grab our attention, to remind us who's really in control of our gifts and our skills and our abilities. This is what he had to do with the Pharisees. So though we want to distance ourselves from the Pharisees sometimes, I believe this is a real thing for us to think about. And there's two ways I think that this can happen. Sometimes this is what it takes for God to remind you of his control. Number one, it could be someone in the church, a brother or sister who you have to trust enough that comes to you and says, I really believe that you're not giving God space in this part of your life. I think God would hold you accountable for the way that you're treating this person, the way you're handling the situation, the way you're handling your money, the way you're handling your family, the way you're handling your temper. There has to be space sometimes in the church to be the hands and feet of Jesus, to come and flip over some tables in our lives. Or another way is sometimes God does this himself. Sometimes God may be allowing things in your life to take control out of your hands. That so much of what we struggle with is this constant sense that we have so much control and say over what happens in our lives. Sometimes God may allow things to happen to remind you of the fact that you don't have final say and you don't have final control. And instead of railing against God that your money situation is what it is, your family situation is what it is, maybe God's trying to teach you something about the fact that I'm in control and you're not, and can you trust me? You've grown too attached to this thing. You've said you want too much say over your 5-year plan, or you want too much say over how your church is run, or you want too much say over how your family goes. I need to give you a little chaos to remind you that I'm the one who's in control of the situation. Instead of railing against God when you feel like you're out of control, maybe God is trying to teach you something. Maybe God's confronting authority in your life. Now, sometimes God confronts, and that's not enough. Because we could just say, well, God, I just disagree. I think you're totally wrong about this. I love that I'm talking about control. Man, baby's crying. It's perfect. I can only control so much when I preach. It's totally cool. But Jesus confronts us sometimes, and that's not enough because we just don't agree. Or the church person comes to us and says, this is a problem, and we're like, nah, I don't believe that. So then maybe God has to reveal further that you are wrong about this, and this is what he does with the Pharisees. He reveals the fact that they understand authority completely wrong. And so I'm going to paraphrase several passages moving forward because it would take too long for me to, well, unless you want me to preach for an hour, we're not going to do that. There's 3 successive things that Jesus does throughout this passage to slowly deal with authority with the Pharisees. And the next thing he does is he reveals it. And the first thing he does is he asks this question. He says, I'll ask you a question. Or they come up to him and they say, by what authority do these things, as I said. And then Jesus says, I'll ask you a question. Was John's baptism from heaven or was it from man? The Pharisees go and they discuss amongst themselves and they say, well, if we say from heaven, they'll say, why didn't you believe him? But if we say from man, we'll be afraid of the crowds because they held that John was a prophet. In their deliberative process, they reveal the fact that they're just blind to the fact that they misunderstand authority because they refuse to acknowledge that John's baptism could be from heaven. And they knew if they said that, then Jesus would confront them with the fact that I just healed people in the temple and you can't see it. And so the backdrop of this whole exchange is Jesus just healed people in the temple. It's obvious where his authority comes from. It comes from God. He couldn't do what he's doing if it wasn't from God. So the Pharisees are trying to nitpick, and Jesus could just say, well, duh, I'm from God. But instead he asked them a question. And I think part of what he's doing is by asking a question, either one, he could try to reveal to them how blind they are. Or two, just when you incriminate someone on the witness stand, it makes them more incriminated. Because by their own answer and their own response, they reveal that they don't get it. So he asked this question and they answer, and the way they answer, they say, we don't know because we can't give you an answer that is helpful to us. Jesus says, well, I'm not going to answer you. But then he proceeds to push their blindness further in front of their face with a parable. Because after he asks that question, he follows it up immediately by saying, okay, what do you think about this? And he tells this parable where he says, a man has two sons. And he asks one son, son, will you go work in the vineyard? And he says, no. But then later he goes and works in the vineyard. He has a second son. He says, son, will you work in the vineyard? He says, yes. But then later he doesn't go. And he asks the Pharisees which one of these did what the father asked. And they rightly respond, the one who basically did what the father asked even though they said they wouldn't. And the point of this little parable is Jesus is trying to get them to acknowledge, is it more important what you do or what you say to God? Is it more important what you do or what you say? Because he knows the Pharisees, sadly, are very hypocritical. They're obsessed with what they say. They don't realize what they do. He asked this question to see if they get it. Maybe if they didn't get it, he'd have an opportunity to say, okay, you're wrong about this whole thing. You're hypocritical because you're more concerned with what you say than what you do. Let's talk about that. But because they get it right, it makes their mistaken understanding of authority even clearer. They know it's more important what you do than what you say. And yet they still are more concerned with what they say than what they do. And Jesus brings it home because after that parable, this is when Jesus starts getting really serious with the Pharisees, and he says, the prostitutes and the tax collectors go into the kingdom of heaven before you. Because John came in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. What he's saying is, you saw somebody doing righteous things. You said that you think it's more important what you do than what you say, and you saw somebody who's doing righteous things, and you couldn't see that he had authority from God. So even when you see what God is doing, even when you see God's work at hand, even though you know that's how God operates, you still don't see it. And so the prostitutes, the tax collectors, the people who are desperate enough to see it, get into the kingdom of heaven before you. And we can look at the Pharisees in this story and be like, oh, these nasty Pharisees, they're so blind. If I saw Jesus healing people, if I saw Jesus doing all this stuff, then I certainly would have turned and repented. But the Pharisees had a lot of reason to not believe he was the Messiah. They had all this backdrop, all this history to be skeptical of this guy saying, I am the Son of God. And just as it is with control in any area of our lives, the more that we think we have control, the easier it is for that control to consume us and for us to not see when God's trying to pull that control out from underneath us. As I said, control is one of those things that we are very, very inclined to think we have more of than we really do. And this is especially true with God. Because whether it be our family or our business or our money or the way we spend our time or the way we volunteer or the people we hang out with, we get more and more accustomed to our rhythms and our patterns and our habits. And we may not even see what God is asking us to do that gets us out of that rhythm, that pattern, that habit. We may not even see what God's authority is challenging us to break out of and submit to because we're so stuck in the way that we see things. That the more we try to control, the less room we give God to have control. And we We may not be the Pharisees who are so stuck on the Messiah being a certain person that we can't acknowledge that he healed somebody. But we could be the parent, or we could be the business person, or we could be the church member that only sees worship done a certain way, or only sees kids raised a certain way, or only sees business done a certain way, or only sees relationships handled a certain way. And there's no space for the Holy Spirit, there's no space for Jesus to flip over a table and say, no, there's space for me here to have control, to have authority. So Jesus is trying to reveal that they don't get it. They still don't get it. And finally, he kind of gives some grander context, I guess, to their mistaken understanding of authority. He confronted them with it. He tried to reveal that you really are blind. You really did see righteousness in front of you, and you didn't see it, and yet they still don't get it. And so then he proceeds to what I would say is he defines it, he contextualizes it, he gives it more backdrop and substance. Because the next thing he says, he then tells a parable that is far more incriminating to the Pharisees. He tells this parable of a landowner who leaves his land to some tenants. And he says, landowner went away and he sent some servants back to his land to get the fruit from the vineyard. But the tenants who stewarded the vineyard, they beat some servants, they killed some others. And then finally he decides, I'm going to send my son, because my son they will respect, and they'll rightfully give him the fruit of the vineyard. But then they say to themselves, this is the heir. So if we kill him, we'll take the inheritance. So they kill the son to take the inheritance. And then Jesus asks the Pharisees, and he says, okay, what will the landowner do with these tenants? And they say, he will put those tenants to a miserable death and entrust the land to tenants who will rightfully steward its fruits. And in that moment, Jesus probably already knew how blind the Pharisees were, but this may, I wonder if it could have been a very sad moment for him to realize just how blind they really were. Because he's talking about them. And that's when he goes and he explains the parable, and he says, again, the prostitutes and tax collectors enter the kingdom of heaven before you. You're so blind. And he says, you're just like all of your ancestors with Israel, who stoned and beat and killed the prophets before you. You're no different than them. You think that you understand how God operates, to the point that when I send my messengers, I send my emissaries, I send John, and I even come in the flesh, you don't see it. And in doing this, I believe he's defining their misunderstanding of authority. He's contextualizing it, giving it some broader context, because this is what happens when we're challenged in our understanding of authority. We like to think, I'm the exception. No. I know you think I'm handling this wrong, God. I know you think that I have too much control. I know you think this is a problem, but it's really not a problem for me. Like, I'm different. I get this better. The Pharisees thought, no, we're clearer headed than our ancestors. We would not make the same mistake that they would. We would not misunderstand or be blind to what God is doing the same way our ancestors were. We're different. We're special. We have a higher level of understanding. And Jesus is trying to bring them back down to earth and say, no, you're no different. You are just as blind as they were. And I would say the same to us, that we're no different. That, again, authority and control is one of those natural vices that so easily pulls us, that it's also one of those things that we can so easily deceive ourselves into thinking we're the exception. No, I know that you think, again, with my kids or my business or my time, that I'm not really giving God space, or I'm not really giving God room, I'm not really submitting to God's authority, but I'm the exception. All of us are equally susceptible to putting our heels in the sand and saying, no, God, I want to maintain control of this. And this is what Jesus is trying to do with the Pharisees, and he's defining it, he's contextualizing it, he's making it broader, that you're misunderstanding authority just like anybody else. And if there's space in your life that you are trying to control too much, or God is challenging you to control too much, or you're going through a season of suffering and things are out of control and he's trying to teach you something, or or he's using the church to challenge your sense of control. You struggle with that just as much as anybody else, because we all naturally want to have a little bit more control of our lives than God may want to ask of us. Because surrender of control is hard. Surrender of control is risky and dangerous and uncomfortable. But it's so much of what relationship with Jesus and following Jesus hinges on. Surrendering control, taking up your cross, dying to yourself. And so if you feel that temptation when that sense of control is being challenged for you to say, no, I'm the exception, I believe Jesus would say, you probably struggle with this just as much as the next person. So have some grace and have some humility to be open to how he may be challenging your sense of control in whatever area of life that things might feel a little out of control right now. Finally, he confronted their sense of authority. He revealed it to them. He gave them some context to it that is no different. And then he kind of reaches the climax of his exchange with the Pharisees in Matthew 21, where he refutes it. And he says this very powerful thing after he told that parable about the tenants in the vineyard. And he says, have you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. And when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. When you are too adhered to your sense of control, it can eventually break you to pieces and crush you. Because if you are in a control battle with God, spoiler alert, you're going to lose. And this is exactly what the Pharisees were trying to do with Jesus. This is what they're trying to do with God. We have control over the temple. We have control and authority over what God does. And Jesus is saying the ultimate outcome of this, Pharisees, is that if you by rejecting me, in and of your sense that you have control, it demonstrates how much more control I have, because I'm God. You try to reject my control, and your rejection of control ultimately will bring you into account, and you will be crushed and will be broken to pieces. And it's fascinating what Jesus does logically. He brings things full circle in a really powerful way by saying that your very thought that you have control is more demonstration of the fact that I am the Son of God. Because the stone that the builders rejected becomes the cornerstone. At the foundation of the Christian faith is this sense of the one who was rejected, the one who we weren't willing to accept, the one who we weren't willing to submit to is our Savior. So that in our lives, so much of when we're inviting Jesus into our lives is when we stop trying to reject this God who would encroach on our sense of control and our sense of comfort. Ultimately, this God who asks us to die to ourselves and take up our cross. At the core of our faith is the surrendering of control. And so that if you reject the surrender of control, if you try to reject Jesus trying to take control from you, it will crush you or break you to pieces because you're fighting against God. You're fighting against Jesus inviting you to surrender. And this is the reality for life and for all of us. Because again, if we are in a control battle with God, you're going to lose. And your losing may look like a lot of different things. But the more that you try to latch on to your family, or you try to latch on to your business, you try to latch on to your time, the tighter you try to hold, the more it slips through your grasp. The more that you idolize other things other than God, the more that it becomes its own burden, its own weight. It begins to crush you. It begins to weigh you down. When you start trying to carry your whole world, and you start trying to carry all the stuff in your life, you realize that you weren't meant to carry your whole world. You weren't meant to carry everything in your life. Jesus was. And the more and more you try to do that, the more and more it will crush you. The more and more it will weigh you down. The more and more your false sense of authority will break you to pieces. So you must surrender your sense of control to Jesus. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. At the cornerstone of our faith is stop fighting for control with God and give it over to Jesus. Let him be the one who takes your family. Where do you feel heavy today? Or do you feel like stressed and overwhelmed? There may be a space in your life that it's because you're trying to protect that thing. You're trying to protect that sense of control. You're trying to protect the outcome that you want. If you keep holding that, it will break you to pieces. It will crush you. It will weigh you down. Because Jesus is ultimately the one in control and the one inviting you to give him control. I want to close with a quote from a song. It's one of my favorite songs. By Reliant K. Super profound. The song is called I Hate Consequences. And there's a bridge in the song where the whole point of the song is when there's consequences, we want to run from God. And we keep running from God, and we keep running from God because we don't want to face God. We don't want to, in this sense, I would say, face the fact that he may be trying to take some burden off our shoulders, and we don't want to face it. And then at the bridge, it says, when I got tired of running from you, I stopped right there to catch my breath. There were words, your words caught my ear, and you said, I miss you, son or daughter. Come home. In my sins, they watched me leave, and in my heart I so believed. The love you felt for me was mine, the love I missed for all this time. And when the doors were closed, I heard no I told you so's. You said the words I knew, you knew. Oh God, I needed you. God, all this time, I needed you. I needed you. I so hate consequences. Running from you is what my best defense is. I hate these consequences because I know that I let you down, and I don't want to deal with that. There's no I told you so's. There's no in your face. Jesus would speak strongly but compassionately to you today. Too much sense of control, too much sense of authority in your life will weigh you down, it will crush you, it will break you to pieces. Let him have control. And trust him with the outcome. And trust him with your burdens. Let him be God, let him be the authority in your life. Don't mistake that you're the one in authority in your life. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you that you are big enough to carry whatever we carry today. You're big enough to control everything in our lives. And we wouldn't put our heels in the sand and fight you, but we would give you all the areas in our lives where we may be trying to hold just a little too tightly. Be Lord, be the authority in our lives. Help us to do that because we know that you are trustworthy. In Jesus' name.